You know something interesting? I can actually use my mind to control matter. No, seriously, I'll do it on camera to prove it. Oh my god, look. Look! The matter that my hand is made out of is moving. And it looks like the only thing that's causing it to move in this random way is my mind. It's actually rather remarkable that we can use our minds to control our own bodies. I mean, yeah, it seems trivial because everybody knows this, but it's remarkable nonetheless. Now, this actually pretty much summarizes what this video is going to be about, but if you're looking for more of an explanation, here it is. So in the last video, I posited a single axiom which actually attributes free will to something. Because the idea is that you have free will, but without clearly defining what you are, this can be actually rather ambiguous. So I posited that it's a person's psyche that has free will. It's you as a psychic being, as an experiential being, rather than you as a material being, and we're attributing free will to that psychic side of your existence. And if you have no clue what I'm talking about, you should probably check out the previous video which explains it all. But by attributing free will to a person's psyche, we're making a claim that actually makes a lot more sense, because this is attributing free will to like a person's personality, to their moral beliefs or to their consciousness, rather than like the individual atoms that comprises their body. And we can call the quality of possessing a psyche sentience. So an organism is sentient if it feels like something to be that organism, i.e. it has a psyche. But this begs the question of how it is that a psyche can actually give you free will. In short, your psyche allows you to stand apart from the physical world, to rise above it, so to speak, and manipulate its trajectory in accordance with your will. And your psyche is capable of directing matter, specifically the matter in your own body, towards manipulating the physical world in order to manifest whatever it is that you desire. So how can the psyche actually do this? To start, consider, is this object sentient? No, at least I think it's not. But if we're being honest, we can't actually tell whether a thing is sentient or not. In fact, I don't know for sure whether you're sentient, and you can't actually really prove that I'm sentient. But clearly psyches do exist, because I know for sure that my own psyche exists, and you're probably as equally convinced of the existence of your own psyche as I am. Plus, the fact that you're understanding these words implies that you must be having some sort of a psychic experience. So we can reasonably suggest that living beings like you and me have a psyche, but objects like iPhones probably don't. At least not yet. So we can ask the question, do bacteria possess sentience? I feel like the answer is no. Again, I don't know for sure, but they don't seem to have complicated nervous systems like we do. So it's a reasonable assumption. If we assume that individual atoms are not sentient, an arbitrary arrangement of those atoms probably also isn't sentient. But clearly at some point during the emergence of complex biological systems, sentience does emerge. In other words, it started to feel like something to be an organism. And your body is made up of trillions of individual cells, and those cells are kind of similar to bacteria. So are those cells individually sentient? It doesn't seem like it, but you, being a collection of these cells, are sentient. Therefore, it seems like a collection of cells arranged in a particular way can have sentience, whereas the individual components don't. Something which I again mentioned in my previous video if you want to check that out. So yes, even though a bacterial cell is marvelously complicated, sentience is probably something that doesn't exist in a single cell, but rather emerges from complex multicellular structures. And as such, according to our axiom, such organisms shouldn't have any free will. Everything that a bacteria does is being driven on by blind mechanical processes and nothing else. But notice that word blind. This implies that sight, being able to perceive the process, gives us some power over the process, which intuitively suggests a connection between sentience and free will, but I digress. A bacteria has no free will because everything it does is dictated by the laws of physics. Yes, it is unbelievably complex, but fundamentally still just matter acting according to the dictates of physical law. Now, what I think a lot of materialists do is to pretty much just scale all of that up. Scale it up, and that's what a human being is. Human behavior is just a very complicated series of causally determined interactions between matter. Similarly to dominoes falling because the domino behind it pushed it. But this can't apply to us because we're not merely material beings. We're sentient beings, experiential beings. The matter within us has given rise to something that's fundamentally different. And this really changes things, as I showed in my last video. So let's proceed with an example of a sentient organism. This goat. This is going to be my free will goat. Pay no attention to his resemblance to the Dark Lord Lucifer, that's merely a coincidence. But this goat is sentient because it experiences things, as all goats presumably do. So sentience gives my goat 3 things which are needed in order for it to have free will. Remember how we defined free will. I'll throw it up again. Free will is the capacity to act towards the fulfillment of one's desires by overcoming any barriers to said desire. So the first thing that's needed is a desire, and only sentient organisms are capable of experiencing desire. A desire is ultimately a wish for a possible future state. So if my goat desires food, it implies that he currently doesn't have food, but wishes to alter the universe in such a way that the end result is him having food. And desire is a psychic experience. Something that isn't capable of having an experience isn't capable of having desires. You might think that something like a bacteria has the desire to survive, but not really. Everything that it does isn't done because it has the subjective feeling of desire, but rather because it's equipped to dynamically interact with its environment in a way that promotes its own survival. It doesn't actually feel that desire to survive. And without a psyche, such an organism is ensnared in a destiny predetermined by the arrangement of its parts. The second thing which sentience provides, which is necessary for free will, is the ability to perceive the external environment, which is needed in order to ascertain the objects of one's desire. This is done through our senses. Our senses allow us to extract information from the environment by creating an internal representation of the external world and codifying it into a psychic format so that we can experience it. For example, you right now are generating such an internal world using your eyes. Your eyes are giving you a lot of information about your external environment and reproducing that information in a format which your mind can access. But even cruder senses still produce an image of our environments. So if all an organism can do is touch, it's still getting information about the environment and still producing a very crude map of its environment. So even if you're not looking at an object, you touching it will give you information about it, such as its weight, its texture, and its shape. And it's really important to note that this map doesn't actually have to be accurate in order for it to be useful. Our brains are constantly filtering perceptions so that we are more attentive to what's actually useful to us, but also things like the sweetness of sugar. Sweetness is not an inherent property to sugar. Rather, sweetness is something that our brains produce when we come into contact with sugar, which motivates us to eat more of it. So in that sense, our brains are giving us information about the environment, not necessarily to tell us what the environment's like, but to tell us what's useful in the environment. The third thing which sentience gives an organism, which is necessary for free will, is the capacity to direct its body in accordance with its will. So the hunger of my goat should be thought of as a constituent part of its psyche, because hunger is something that's subjectively experienced. And its hunger can somehow seize the goat and cause the matter in its body to move towards food. And that might sound like a strange way to think about things, because ordinarily we kind of separate the idea of like hunger from the goat itself, but since we're attributing free will to the psyche of the goat, the hunger should be thought of as part of the goat. And so in a sense, it does have its own free will, which is why it is capable of making the goat move. So the fact that your psyche is directly connected to your body means that your psyche can use your body to get what it wants. And we know this is the case because, again, I can cause my hand to do this very strange thing that it's doing, and the only thing that's directing it is my mind. Hands don't ordinarily do things like this. They can only do things like this if they're connected to a psyche. And I know that it's my psyche that's responsible for this because I can't just tell matter to move in an arbitrary way. The idea of moving randomly is an abstract idea. So an abstract idea is responsible for this absurdity that you're witnessing right now. It's not just particle physics, it's not just a biochemical phenomenon, it's my psyche manipulating a biochemical phenomenon in order to get matter to obey an abstract idea. Now, hunger is less of an abstract principle, but it's still psychic. It still has a psychic existence. And so an organism that's motivated by the feeling of hunger is fundamentally different from an organism that just seeks food but doesn't actually desire food, doesn't experience that desire. And again, what I'm saying is that there's a sense in which the hunger itself is the entity that has free will. Hunger is a part of your psyche, and so it forms the object to which we're attributing free will. Similarly, things like pain have free will. If I touch a hot surface, the pain is able to move my body in order to get what it wants, i.e. to extinguish itself. So only a sentient organism has the capacity to act towards the fulfillment of its desires by overcoming any barriers to said desire, because it has these three characteristics. But at this point, you may have an objection. Because the example that we're using is my free will goat having the desire for food. But you might be thinking that its hunger wasn't something that it chose, it was predetermined. The goat didn't choose to be hungry, it just is. And so it doesn't actually have free will because it didn't will to be hungry, right? Now I have many responses to this point, and I'm going to be elaborating upon some of them in a future video, which will be specifically about determinism. But one thing I'll say is that, again, it's the hunger to which we're attributing the idea of free will. So the claim is, in a sense, hunger has free will. Wherever the hunger came from, even if it was predetermined, we're still asking the question, does the hunger have, in the present, the capacity to exert its free will. And the same can be asked about any psychic experience. Does pain have free will? Does fear have free will? And I know this is a strange way to think about things and not really how we ordinarily perceive ourselves. Like, you don't usually think of yourself as your fear. But I argue that you really should. And again, this is consistent with our axiom that it's the psyche that possesses free will. So we really need to consider whether saying that the hunger wasn't chosen by the goat really says anything about whether the hunger itself is free. Now, we're going to be talking about that much more in the future because there's a lot more to discuss with respect to determinism and whether the idea of determinism really defeats the concept of free will. But the most important thing we want to understand for this video is, if you remember from part 2 in my series, I hope it's part 2, I discussed whether it's even meaningful to talk about the concept of free will in general without any context. It's possible that the abstract idea of free will in general doesn't really make any sense. And the reason we decided this is because, if you remember, I gave you 5 examples of different things that you might will. And they varied with respect to attainability. Some of them were very easy to attain. Some of them were more difficult. Some were really, really difficult, but still conceivably possible. And then others were just outright impossible. So is it fair to say that you're equally free to do any of those things? Well, no, because again, our definition of free will relates to the capacity to overcome any barriers to what you want. But some barriers are insurmountable, and hence you're not simply free to attain them. So the idea of free will in general is kind of meaningless. Whether or not you have free will needs to be asked in consideration to what it is you're actually willing. Because without this context, the question is kind of vague and very poorly defined. It would be like asking the question, do you have responsibility? Do people have responsibility? I mean, what does that mean without specifying what you have responsibility for? Whether or not somebody has responsibility depends on what it is that we're asking them to be responsible for. Is it your responsibility to take care of your children? In most countries, yes. Is it your responsibility to rehabilitate injured crows? Well, unless you're a wildlife rehabilitator like I used to be, the answer is probably no. So just like it's meaningless to ask whether somebody has responsibility in general, it's meaningless to ask whether somebody has free will in general. Free will with respect to what? We must always pose the question with respect to a specific context. And we can codify this as an axiom, which will be, free will is context dependent, varying based on the feasibility and constraints of what one desires in a given context. So with this idea established, let's go ahead and compare my free will goat with my unfree will goat. Now, just to be clear, my unfree will goat doesn't entirely lack free will, but rather I'm going to be using him as an example to show how sentience can contribute to the idea of free will. Suppose both goats want the same thing. They both desire food. That means that they both have a will, the same will. But we can show how the degree of sentience can determine how free they are to pursue this will. Let's say that there's some food nearby within eyesight of either of the goats. But suppose that my unfree will goat is blind. His blindness presents a barrier to him obtaining the food, so in a sense, he's less free to obtain it than the free will goat. This is because the free will goat has more information about the environment, because its psyche is able to extract that information from the environment and codify it as a psychic experience. And this makes the goal of acquiring food much more obtainable. So in general, the more information your psyche has about a specific thing, the more free will it has to attain that thing. If your psyche has no information about a thing, then you should have no free will with respect to that thing. So, for example, if somebody whips a baseball directly at your head, are you free to avoid it? Well, you can only be free to avoid it if you see it coming. Because if you do see it, you have information about its trajectory. And with this information, you can redirect your own body such that you avoid getting hit. Because if you see the baseball, you now have information about its trajectory, and you can use this information to redirect yourself, such that you subvert what was previously fated to be you getting smacked in the head with a baseball. But if you don't see the ball, then what? Well, assuming that nobody calls it out, or you don't get any other information about it, there's no way you can dodge it. You are not free to avoid the baseball. It will hit you, and there's nothing you can do about it. So if your psyche doesn't have information about something, it can't have free will over it. So just think about all of the things which your psyche lacks information about, which is presumably a lot. Even things happening inside your own body are currently happening with no psychic knowledge of them. And so you don't have free will over them. But then consider everything that your psyche does know. Everything that you can perceive with your senses, and we're only focusing on your senses for now, is potentially within the purview of that which you can influence, that which you have free will over. Now, just because you have information about something doesn't necessarily mean that you will have free will over it. Rather, information is just one necessary precursor, and the other is something we're going to talk about soon. So for example, you probably have information about the moon. You know where it is because you can see it, and you might be able to also see how it's moving. But does this mean that you're free to push the moon into the Earth? Well, not necessarily, and I would oppose you if you tried to do it. But my point is that doing that would be completely impossible if you didn't know where the moon was. And it would be totally inconceivable if you just didn't know what the moon was at all. So knowledge is the first step towards your evil plan, and a lack of knowledge makes this plan much harder. So let's apply this understanding to the baseball metaphor. So even if you do see the baseball flying towards you, according to what we just said about the moon, it doesn't necessarily guarantee that you will dodge it. You might not be able to move out of the way in time. It's just that not seeing it guarantees that you can't avoid it. Seeing it is the first step to avoiding it, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you will avoid it. But imagine if you were capable of processing much more information about the ball much more quickly. Like if your brain was much bigger and much more efficient, and maybe you can even perceive the ball with so much computational power that from your perspective it looks slowed down, like the way that flies can apparently perceive time at a slower rate than we can. Such a hypothetical person would have much more information about the ball, and so would be much more free to dodge it. So you can imagine future forms of sentience that gain in their capacity to process information about the world, and therefore would have much more free will with respect to the objects of the world. And you can even hypothetically imagine some kind of entity that has all of the information in the universe. Would such an entity have maximum free will? That's just some food for thought. But this also shows that some animals have more free will than others. So for example, jellyfish, assuming that they're sentient, can't see anything, and so they would have less free will than non-jellyfish, i.e. regular fish, at least with respect to certain wills. Again, it really depends on what they want. But back to my goats. Imagine that both of my goats can see, but there's no food anywhere within eyesight. Now suppose that my free will goat has a stronger sense of smell. His sense of smell also codifies information about the environment. And so he can gain more information about the environment than the unfree will goat. And again, this information allows it to more seamlessly overcome the barrier that prevents it from getting what it wants. Because maybe that goat can smell something in the air like pollen, which will give it a sense of where the food is. My unfree will goat, on the other hand, has to just kind of start looking in a random direction. So it's still free to pursue that, but it has a much greater barrier to overcome. And that barrier might be so great that it doesn't overcome it, which is why more information allows you to overcome those barriers much more easily. But let's assume that they have a different will. Let's say that both goats desire to not be eaten by a predator. So imagine they're in the exact same situation. It's dark and there's a wolf lurking around somewhere. And imagine that my free will goat is able to spot the wolf that was trying to be stealthy. Now that it knows where the wolf is, it is more free to avoid it. But let's say that my unfree will goat, or in this case I should say my unlucky goat, has no idea where the wolf is. There's a sense in which he's less free to do anything about it, no? In fact, what I think this shows is that predatory animals employ stealth in order to reduce the free will of the prey, and in a sense give themselves more free will. This raises the kind of creepy possibility that someone or something is deliberately keeping you in the dark about something to reduce your free will with respect to that thing. Are there company secrets that your boss is keeping from you in order to reduce your power? And what is your government hiding from you to suppress your power? But another example would be something like war. Armies need to do reconnaissance in order to understand enemy movements and try to understand their plans. And I believe the reason they do this is fundamentally to give themselves more free will, because more information equates to more free will. And that's the whole point of getting information. So we've discussed the fact that information is one aspect of sentience. Another aspect is the fact that sentience is capable of directing your body. Your psyche can seize hold of your body and direct it towards whatever it wants. So the more matter you can mobilize towards the attainment of your goal, the more likely you will be to obtain that goal. So take my free will goat and my unfree will goat again, and suppose that they both want food again, but imagine that my unfree will goat is paralyzed. Sorry, unfree will goat. If it's incapable of moving its legs, I would say its free will has drastically decreased, because its psyche has lost the ability to move the matter in its body. Because the definition of free will that we're working with involves overcoming any barriers to that which you desire. But without its legs, it now has no capacity to overcome those barriers. Now, you don't even need to refer to something like paralysis to show that this is the case, because there's an example I presented in my second video which compared a skinny person to a strong person and asked which one is more free to lift a heavy weight. I would say that the strong person is more free to do that, simply because he has more strength and therefore there are less obstacles for him to do that. The skinny person would have to exert more effort, or it's even the case that the skinny person's muscles just can't handle it. And not just strength, but also dexterity. And we can demonstrate this at the individual level. For example, try brushing your teeth with your non-dominant hand. Real weird. I'm actually decently good at this because I actually practiced brushing my teeth with my left hand as an experiment that I started a while ago. But for most people, it's going to feel really weird and clumsy because this hand is not as dexterous as your dominant hand. So in a sense, your dominant hand has more free will to brush your teeth than your non-dominant hand. It's not that your non-dominant hand completely lacks the free will to be able to do this, it just has much more barriers to overcome. And this isn't just about your body either, it also extends to the idea of tools. If I ask this ancient Babylonian man to calculate the square root of a 6-digit number, there's a good chance he won't be able to do it. But I can do this really easily because I have a calculator. And so I would say I'm more free to do it than he is. And if I wanted to travel to a distant city, the barrier to doing that would be much greater if cars didn't exist. But because cars do exist, the barrier is reduced. So with a car, I have much more free will to be able to do that. So if we go back to that example of your evil plan to push the moon into the earth, the first thing you would need to know is obviously where the moon is and what its trajectory is. The second thing you need is the ability to mobilize enough resources to do something which is extremely difficult. So yes, this task might seemingly be impossible for us with our current state of technology, but it's still seemingly possible, right? Like if you could somehow get a really powerful, strong spaceship to push the moon into the earth, I don't know, you will have accomplished this. You will have overcome all of the barriers that stood in your way from accomplishing it, assuming you also overcome my desire to stop you. So with what we've discussed in this video, we can posit some additional axioms. The first one will be, only entities that are sentient are capable of having desires. We then want to capture the fact that psyches are capable of extracting information about the external environment through their sense organs. So we can write the axiom, psyches can hold information about the external world received through sensory perception, with the amount of information varying based on the sensitivity and functionality of sense organs. Then we're going to want to capture what I said about the relationship between the amount of information you can acquire about a situation and the ease of completing tasks related to that situation. The ease or difficulty of a task is influenced by the amount of relevant information a psyche possesses through sensory perception about the task and its context. So these three axioms capture the fact that only psyches can have desires in the first place, and psyches can also gain information about the environment, and this information is quantitative. So the more information you have about something, presumably the more free will you have over it. Now, we're also going to want to capture what I've said about the fact that your psyche can control your body, as well as the fact that your psyche can employ tools in order to overcome barriers to what it is that you desire. The ease or difficulty of tasks is influenced by the capabilities of the body, including muscle memory, physical abilities, and coordination, as well as the availability and proficiency in using external tools. So notice so far, none of these axioms explicitly state the idea of free will, because free will is the thing that we're trying to prove. Yes, I've been speaking about free will as though it already exists, but that's more for the sake of argument. Which is why the axioms themselves have no mention of free will, other than the definition of free will and what we're attributing free will to. So what I've tried to show through this video is why it is that a psyche can have free will, and how different psyches can have different amounts of free will depending on the information that they have, as well as what it is that they're trying to do. And also the fact that they can mobilize different amounts of resources in order to attain what it is that they want. But I'm not actually done talking about the relationship between the psyche and free will, because so far I've been excluding one particular aspect of sentience, which is consciousness. And I mean consciousness defined in the Jungian or Janesian sense, in the sense of knowledge and awareness. Because consciousness gives us a completely different way to represent information about things and understand those things extremely deeply. And so consciousness actually gives us much more free will. And I believe that this capacity, the fact that humans are capable of being conscious, actually gives us much more free will than other animals, which explains why we can do so much more, like go to planets and manipulate our own genetic code. So the next video is going to be entirely focused on the relationship between consciousness and free will. And this will show that consciousness is an unbelievably powerful tool that gives you so much capacity to alter your environment in profound ways. And it's really the ticket to increasing your own free will. So I really hope you look forward to that. Have a good day, and may good luck always come your way.